Grunwald Spear, emanating from London. Dr. Grunwald Spear is a historian, specializes in the study of the Nazi Holocaust and Jewish issues around that. Her books range from women's experience in the Holocaust, the other Schindlers, and particularly the book I want to talk about today, which is Who Betrayed the Jews. Um, Agnes, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon.
It's my pleasure.
So let's just first of all talk a little bit about your background and being the youngest survivor of the Holocaust.
Well, no, I'm one of the youngest. I can't claim to be the youngest.
Okay.
Yes. Well, I was born into a Hungarian Jewish family in Budapest in July 1944. And in November 1944, my mother and I were sent to the Budapest ghetto, from which we were liberated in January 1945, when I was 6 months old. So I
Mm,
am one of the youngest Holocaust survivors. My father had been taken away as a forced
yes.
labourer by the Hungarian fascists
Mm,
in 1943. And this is very important because most people don't know much about Hungary and the Holocaust, but Hungary wasn't occupied by the Germans until March 1944. So the Hungarians themselves had their own anti-Jewish legislation from the
mm,
late 1930s. And so he was taken away. And then, bizarrely, he was allowed back on leave in October 1943,
mm,
when my mother told me that was when I was conceived, but then he was sent off somewhere else. And he didn't come back till March 1945. He was very embittered by his experiences
mm,
after the war when we were settled in England after 1947. My mother would have liked more children because she was the eldest of four, but he wouldn't have any more children.
mm,
He said it wasn't a world to bring children into.
mm,
And in 1955, when I was 10, he committed suicide.
mm,
I don't think he ever really came to terms with what had happened to him.
mm,
And so I've lived with the Holocaust all my life, but I never studied it. And if it came up on the television or, anything, I ignored it. I thought I know all I need to know from what my mother had told me. But
mm,
in my, I had my children quite late. I was married for 10 years before I had my three lovely sons. And so I was in my 50s when they were teenagers. And I became concerned that if they asked me about the Holocaust, I didn't really feel I knew enough about it to talk to them. And as a mother, I always tried to be very honest and straightforward with my sons. And just
mm,
as I was pondering that, I was living in Sheffield in the north of England at the time. Someone told me that Sheffield University was doing a master's in Holocaust studies. And I thought, aha, that's for me. And so I
mm,
signed up, and it was a 2-year part time course, which I enjoyed enormously. I had a wonderful history teacher when I was at school, and she always said, education is wasted on the young. And I think that when you study late in life, you're studying what you want to study in your own time. And I found it really very enjoyable. And obviously, I learned a lot.
mm,
I had to write a dissertation to get my master's, and I wrote about Varian Fry. Now, as a good American, I'm sure you know who Varian Fry is.
yes. Mm,
Yes, very interesting man. And for the audience, for a long time, he was the first American to be recognized as a righteous amongst the nations. And he was sent to France after the fall of France to rescue Jews that were stuck in Marseille. And he did the
mm,
most remarkable job. He was sent, according to the story, with 200 visas that President Roosevelt had signed. And
Hmm.
$3,000, and one of them was strapped to his legs, but I can't remember which one it was. But anyhow, he was only meant to be there for a month, and he
Hmm.
was there for over a year, and he probably rescued about 4,000 people, but it's awfully difficult
Oh,
to tell.
incredible story.
Yeah, and he got into terrible trouble when he got back for not following orders, as it were, ironically. So
Right.
anyhow, so that was very interesting, and I, in fact, and I got a distinction for my uh, dissertation, so that was great. But that led me
Indeed.
to have an interest in Holocaust rescue, and why you would do it, because it was such a dangerous thing to do.
Hmm.
And so I did a lot of research over quite a long period, because I still had young sons at home, and so I got divorced in the middle and so on. So it took about 9 years to collect information on about 30 different stories, but I had connection with the relatives of the rescuer or the rescued. So I was able to establish what their motivation was and so on. And so I ended up with all this information sitting in a filing cabinet. And I
Oh,
was desperate to get it published, because there's no point in doing research if it just sits in a filing cabinet.
indeed.
And so that was how my first book, Who Betrayed the Other Schindlers, came
Yeah,
to
the
be
Schindlers.
published.
Yeah.
Yet when I was 65, and it was really, in the end, although I'd struggled to get it published, it was a great surprise to me to be published at that age. And then it really changed my life, because I was invited to lecture, and there was a lot of interest. And so my life trundled on. And then after about 2 years, I realized that I actually missed A, doing the research, and B, doing the writing. I knew I liked doing research from stuff I'd done years ago. We'd lived in a
Mm.
village in
Right.
Worcestershire, and I'd set up a local history society and so on. So I knew I liked research, but what I hadn't realized was that I actually really enjoyed writing, and just enjoyed the whole process of editing the text and looking at it the next day and fiddling about with it and so on.
Right.
And so, having written about what you might call the good guys, I thought I'd write about the other ones, which is how the book Who Betrayed the Jews came.
Mm.
When you put the two books together, Who Betrayed the Jews is considerably thicker. It's over 600 pages, and I could have
Well, a
written
lot more material to work with, I suppose.
much more material to work with.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm very proud of the book, and I wanted people to know what really happened. And well, as you know, it's very difficult to write about the Holocaust chronologically. So
Right.
my books are all written in chapters of different topics.
Hmm.
So Who Betrayed the Jews has got chapters on betrayal by your government, betrayal in education, betrayal from
Right.
your neighbours, your friends, and so on. And as I say, I'm very proud of it.
Well, I want to. I mean, a couple of things come to mind. First of all, I've noticed that there's a pattern, and this is probably true, not just of people who had a brush with the Holocaust, but even people who went to war. That there's often a reluctance to talk about it, and even in my own family, in my wife's family, we had an uncle who didn't talk about his involvement in World War II until toward the end of his life. And I think that there are a lot of cases like that. And so people come forward decades later and start to discuss what happened. So um, it seems like that might be a little bit in terms of your own experience that you started to delve into it much, much later. And I don't know if that's a psychological thing or if it's just maybe a processing thing. The other thing I want to mention, just for background, is that, as you say, Hungary was not occupied by the Nazis until mid 1944 when they had a full scale invasion of Hungary. Before that, it was a fascist government of Horthy, and it was not. It had anti-Semitic laws, but at the same time, it wasn't as bad as Nazi Germany and Nazi occupied Europe in that they didn't send people off to the death camps. That only happened after Hitler invaded Hungary, which ironically happened toward the end of the war, and there was a full scale deportation at that point. And it's very strange that that would have happened because at that point the Nazis were losing and they were retreating on all fronts, and yet they still dedicated resources to take out the Jews. You know,
Yes.
it's
Well, it was an obsession, wasn't it? I think
yeah,
you said the middle of July. That's not strictly correct, as it was March 1944.
okay,
And actually, I mean, my mother was told. I was born in July, and sometime between July and November, she was told to report the next day.
right,
And she tried to leave me with her mother-in-law because her own mother had died. But my mother was breastfeeding me, and so there were issues about that. So in the end, she went the next morning with me in her arms, and all she ever said was that the man in charge sent back the women with children. And I'd always thought that we would have been sent to Auschwitz, but I only learnt comparatively recently that the trains from Hungary to Auschwitz stopped on the 8th of July, and I was born on the 14th. So I
mm-hmm.
don't know where we would have gone, but obviously, I don't think it would have been a very good place. But the Hungarian soldiers who looked after the Jewish forced laborers treated them incredibly badly. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you were right in what you were saying, that they weren't being sent to Auschwitz before the Germans arrived, but certainly
Certainly it was no picnic. Yeah, I mean it was not.
very few of the forced laborers came
Yeah,
back. My father was extremely fortunate that he made it back, so I don't think we should underplay, what was
no,
in
no,
it.
no, not at all. I mean, it was
No.
not exactly a nice time. Now, did your I mean, your mother kind of reminds me a little bit. I don't know if you're familiar with Viktor Frankl and his story, the Man's Search for Reason, meaning, which has had a big influence on me. He was a psychiatrist in Vienna who was put into the concentration camps,
Mm.
and his book is How He Survived It. And your mother seems to have a similar story. I mean, in terms of how to work with people in a situation like that, and these little techniques that he developed to help him get through a situation where people were dropping like flies all around him. And it's an extraordinary message, I mean, just psychologically, and how anybody can deal with extreme adversity. I mean, you can't get worse than that. You've lost all freedom, and you're basically a complete slave and victim to this camp. Um,
Well, I think in
yep.
a way, my mother, in some ways, my mother was fortunate in that she had me to look after, um, and and the fact, she was very keen sportswoman in her
Mm-hmm.
youth, and I was a bit of disappointment to her in that department. But she was able to breastfeed me all through, even when she had very little food to eat. And as you know, Budapest has very cold winters, and in the
Mm-hmm.
ghetto, there was very little food and no heating unless you could find a bit of furniture to burn, and so on. But I think the fact that she had me to look after her, she had to look after me, probably, gave her a purpose rather than
Mm.
just turning her face to the wall, as many people did.
Right.
And she kept me warm, she kept me safe, and I think it's quite remarkable.
It is.
She was she was a very strong woman, and uh, I mean, I can tell you about her and the Russian soldiers after the liberation if you've got time. Otherwise,
Right. Well, that brings up the issue of, I mean, in Budapest, you had the very famous Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish ambassador, who really put his neck out in terms of handing out visas for Jews. He disappeared in the maws of the Soviet occupiers. I mean, no one
well,
ever heard of
that's
him
right.
again. Yeah,
Yes, and he wasn't the only one. I mean, there were
right.
other people. Yeah, there was Otto Lutz from Switzerland, who was the Swiss ambassador in Budapest. I
Hmm.
wrote about him in my first book because I met his stepdaughter. And
Incredible.
there was somebody else.
There was also the Japanese ambassador to Vilnius, um,
Well, I'm
named
talking about Budapest.
and Budapest, right?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
but
But
I
there
mean
was
it's a
somebody
phenomenon.
else. I think he was from Latin America. I can't remember the name. It's quite a while since I wrote the book.
Sure, and
But
also I mean I'm thinking of Sugihara was from Lithuania, and he rescued Jews. There were people like that. I mean, throughout there was even this Nazi high-ranking general who rescued Jews. I mean, there were just people who put their neck out at great personal risk to they had a calling. I mean, it's an
well,
extraordinary
that's right.
story.
Yes, I mean that's what I wrote about in my first book, and um, particularly in America, where they have greater resources than most people. There's been a lot of research on on what makes a rescuer, and it's quite difficult to define because sometimes they talk about the family and so on.
Hmm.
But there are cases where there were siblings, but it was only one of them that decided to rescue Jews. And in fact, in my book, there's a couple of sisters in Austria, and one helped a Jew, and a sister went mad at her, for putting them at risk and so on, and telling her she was stupid and all the rest of it. So it's I think they're just people who are they just have something inside of them which motivates them. And I mean, and, the book is called The Other Schindlers. But if you think about Schindler, I
Right,
mean, he was an absolute rogue before
right,
the war. He was a
yeah,
bastard to his wife after the war. He was an alcoholic. He lived off what his the people he rescued sent him, and yet in that one moment
hmm,
when it was required, he knew how to do the decent thing.
right.
Um, and
Well,
Varian Fry was, he always said he
yes.
was no hero. I mean, his life, was quite odd. But again, at that point, he said, well, if they couldn't find anyone else, he would go. And he did. Um,
Oh yeah, incredible stories. But then, of course, you get into your book, "Who Betrayed the Jews," which is, as you say, the bad guys involved here. Um, how pervasive was? I mean, I know that obviously Nazi Germany implemented anti-Semitic laws right away. I mean, the Nuremberg laws. Jews were not, the businesses they started confiscating them, and they couldn't. They had special taxes, and then that eventually led to more extreme laws where they were banned from different professions.
no, but
And
that's sorry.
yeah,
That's not right because the Jews were losing their jobs in 1933 as soon as Hitler came to power, and
right,
Dachau was built in 1933. So it all started straight away. The Nuremberg laws didn't come in until 1936. I
okay.
mean, I think at the time that Hitler came to power, I don't think the final solution had been dreamt of. I think they came
No,
to it
it,
gradually.
it kind of worked into it to the point where
Yes.
eventually the Wannsee Conference, the war was already in full fling. Um, one of the issues I've kind of been fascinated by is that in 1938, after the Kristallnacht, which of course Jewish businesses were looted and burned, and Jews were taken away for the first time en masse to concentration camps. There was the Evian conference at a spa in France, headed by the United States, unfortunately, and there were delegates there from countries all over the Western world, Latin America, Canada, Europe, to try to figure out what to do with Jewish refugees who were looking to get out of Germany at that time. And the decision that they arrived at was that they would do nothing, that there would be no acceptance of refugees, and that included countries that were willing to accept refugees. It was right after that that you had the USS Liberty take off and land on the coast of Cuba. Cuba was willing to accept them, and it was turned back because of people in Roosevelt's State Department, particularly Breckinridge Long and others, who called the Cubans and said, "You have to turn it back." And what was that all about? I mean, basically, I mean, obviously Hitler and the Nazis are totally and 100% responsible for the Holocaust, but nevertheless, the Western countries, the Western democracies, they played a complicit role in that they would not allow Jews to leave. They sealed Europe into a gigantic prison camp. And when I say, by the way, these Jews were not, these are middle class people. I mean, their professions. Jews tend to be highly educated. They could have made great contributions to these countries. What was that about? Why did they do that, do you think?
Well, the answer, as far as the British were concerned, as I understand it, was that they were worried about increasing anti-Semitism by letting all these foreign Jews come in. But, you and I are in 2024, and it's 5 months since October the 7th, 2023. And you've seen how the world has treated Israel
Right.
In the last few months. And I'm a great tweeter. I know they don't call it Twitter anymore, but I can't call it X. It's
X, yeah.
ridiculous.
Oh, I love Twitter too, and I also do Twitter a lot of that.
Yeah. And the point is, a lot of people, I've seen tweets where people have said that I never understood how the Nazis could behave like that. But now I know. And that's the situation. Israel is being clobbered from every direction. There's I saw something yesterday about a place in Canada, Hamilton, where they're not allowing I can't remember because there's a cinema in London called the Rio, which is refusing to screen the final of the Eurovision Song Contest because Israel's being allowed to participate. And this is an independent cinema that claims to be culturally diverse. And then there's some hoo-ha about a cinema in Hamilton who's refusing to show a Jewish film or something. And people are calling for boycotts of Israel, stopping to send arms, all the rest of it, and so on. And America and various other countries are poking their noses into Israeli politics and saying they should have an election and they should get rid of it.
Oh, it's terrible. I mean, especially Charles Schumer.
I mean, sitting in London, looking at the prospects for the American presidential election, and you've got those two duffers, pensioners. They're even older than me, I think. And for the country of 300 million people, I would have thought you could have found two slightly more sparkling candidates. So, but everybody feels that they've got a right to comment on Israel and what's happening in Israel, and Israel's doing it wrong. But, I think the bottom line is, it's good old anti-Semitism. I mean, it's nothing else.
Yeah. But what shocks people is that, you always have the old line anti-Semites on the far right, but how the left has become so openly anti-Semitic, in my opinion, right after Israel was attacked on October 7th, even before they had stopped the terrorists, they were still in Israel. You had Harvard here in Boston come out with all these student organizations signing a letter condemning Israel and saying that Israel was responsible for this invasion. I mean,
that's right.
These are America's best and brightest. I mean, these are very liberal people. They're the scones of liberal families. What was going on with that?
Well, yes. I mean, liberalism is it's quite difficult to define in this day and age. I mean, to me, obviously, I don't actually remember 1948, but, I was alive when Israel was created and recreated, I should say.
Indeed.
And, there was always right-wing anti-Semitism.
Sure.
I think there was always some left-wing anti-Semitism. And now, of course, we have the Muslim anti-Semitism. So It's coming from all directions.
Getting it on all three sides.
Well, exactly. And I think people are not acknowledging the true situation. I mean, in London, we have these protest marches every Saturday, more or less, and with vile placards. And
it's horrible. And what's the deal with Great Britain on that? I mean,
well, the unfortunate thing is that the British believe in free speech, and the Metropolitan Police apparently are independent. Nobody can actually order them, to have a different policy, which I think is absolutely ridiculous because they
Yeah.
banned these marches in France. I was told they'd been banned in Germany as well, but then I tweeted that and somebody else said no, they weren't banned in Germany, so I don't know. But one man's free speech is another person's prejudice. So I think it's difficult, and I think I do worry about it. I worry about the world my
It's a
grandchildren.
worry, and I tend to I disagree in that I even though I find this speech to be abhorrent and vile, I tend to be lean in the direction of free speech, but challenged. I want to be able to debate these people, and I do as best I can because I think that when you debate them and you bring reason to the table, the people make up their own minds, and I just don't think most people support them. It's a very loud minority, and average people are not on board, at least not in the United States. I mean, Britain has a history of, first of all, I mean, it recognized the Palestine Mandate, but at the same time, during World War II, they had ships off the coast of Palestine to keep Jews from going in. I mean, this
Oh
was,
yes, yes, that's
yeah,
right. And even when there were Holocaust survivors um, on boats, they wouldn't let them in. And it's that's a whole black saga in Britain's history. But
indeed.
you talk about wanting to talk to these people, but if you've
Yeah.
seen the pictures of the number of people, marching across Waterloo Bridge or Westminster Bridge or whatever it was, I mean, you can't go and talk to all those people. And also, they don't really know what they're marching for. I mean, there was
No,
a
they don't.
case a
You're
week
right.
or two ago. This chap had this placard which said global jihad, and somebody stopped him and said, do you know what jihad means? And he didn't know. And on Twitter, you'll see people always um,
Oh,
flaunting the
they're
word
very,
Zionism.
it's shocking.
But they
Yeah,
don't
how
know what
ignorant.
Zionism is. They don't know what
No,
Zionism
that's
is.
right. It's shocking how
Um,
ignorant they are. And these are supposedly the most educated people, but I think they're doing it because they kind of swept up by this mob propaganda. I think a lot of it is frankly funded by Qatar and by Arab enemies of
Iran.
Israel,
Mm.
who've given tens of millions of dollars to American colleges, and the propaganda level is extreme. I just think that. I mean, the only way to confront that is simply and carefully and even kindly educating people and telling people the truth.
That takes time, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah. I mean, I think it's
And the
the only way.
hostages haven't got time.
No, well, that's right. I mean, in Israel, I hope and pray that Israel gets this done as soon as possible. It's not easy, and people need to understand that. They accuse Israel of genocide. I mean, if Israel wanted to commit genocide, they could just blow the whole place up. But they have to go in, young men and women go in, and they surgically are trying to find this enemy and find these hostages. By going door to door, it's very, very difficult and dangerous, especially when you have an enemy that's fighting in urban settings and they're disguising themselves in civilian clothes and hiding behind their own children.
Well,
And
that's right. And the thing is, I don't know whether you've come across him. He is on Twitter, a chap called Colonel Richard Kemp. And he was a major in the British Army in Afghanistan, and obviously he knows about fighting. And he
mm,
always says he's an enormous friend of the Jews in Israel, and he always repeatedly says the IDF is the most moral army in
of course,
history, and the
yeah.
civilian deaths proportionate to what they've done are very low. And he is a very powerful voice, but I'm not sure how many people listen to him.
Right,
And everybody assumes he's a Jew, which he isn't.
right.
But
There's
he's
some
a
good
remarkable
voices out there.
man.
I mean, Douglas Murray comes to mind also. He's a British journalist,
Yes.
and he's very good. And there's even this Christian program that's very good, the Daybreak USA, that I watch on TV. They're doing a really good job of getting to news that the media in this country is not covering about what's really going on in Israel. So, I mean, there are some resources.
Yes, but
There
you
are
see,
some
in
people.
England, we've got the problem with the BBC, which is appalling on
What's,
Israel Palestine,
yeah,
and it has been for years and years. There was a report in 2004 called the Balin Report, which is never on the BBC's coverage of Israel and Palestine, and it's never ever been published. And apparently, I've been told that the BBC has spent hundreds of thousands of pounds on lawyers' fees to prevent being forced to publish that. But what the hell are they hiding? And Jeremy Bowen, who's the head Middle East chap, he was criticised in 2009, but he's still the head of the Middle Eastern Report on the BBC, and it's absolutely disgraceful. And there's a chap called Danny Cohen, who used to be the director of BBC TV. Not surprisingly, he's a Jew, and he said only 1 or 2 days ago that the BBC must be investigated for its completely partial reporting of this, the last few months. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous. I've tweeted several times that I remember, in the war, people hid in their cellars, risking their lives to listen to the BBC to find out the truth about what was going on.
Yeah, it used to be. I mean, I read that like Menachem Begin learned how to speak English by listening to the BBC.
Yeah, but then I always end the tweet by saying, would people do that now? And
how about your Prime Minister Rishi Sunak? And what about the King? They seem to be pro-Israel, no?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I thought that David Cameron was, and I think Sunak has made a big mistake by inviting him back as Foreign Secretary, because in fact the UK's policy on Israel has slightly tilted since Cameron has been Foreign Secretary.
And that's sad, especially since Cameron himself, I think, has a Jewish background.
I'm not aware of it.
Oh, okay. Maybe not.
But you may be right. But I mean, the trouble is that all politicians are conscious of the vote. Yes. And, and the trouble in this country is, it might not be a problem in America, is that the Jewish population in this country is very small. It used to be about 300,000. I don't think it's as much as that now. I think there's about 4 or 5 million Muslims in this country. Right. So, the MPs look to their constituency votes, and inevitably, with a lot of them, that's going to influence the stance that they take. Mm-hmm. And I mean, obviously, there are some decent people out there, but it's very difficult.
Answering to their constituency. I mean, recently Galloway was reelected, wasn't he?
Yes, but he's elected in a town which is predominantly Muslim. It's got very high Muslim population.
I think in this country, traditionally, both liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, left and right, generally have been pro-Israel. There's been a slight change, I think, maybe in the last 10 years, in terms of the Democratic Party, not so much. But still, it's holding pretty firm. At least so far, although Biden seems to be kowtowing to the left wing of his party. And I wouldn't say he's throwing Israel under the bus, but, it looks like, there's some softening there. So I hope that for all people's sakes, Israel can finish the job, God willing, in Gaza as soon as possible. Get it done.
Well, the point is, if they don't finish Hamas off this time, it's just going to come back to bite again. Yeah. Because that's what they've said. I mean, they've been quite blatant for years that their aim is to destroy the state of Israel and get rid of all the Jews. And they're not going to change policy.
Oh, no, but at least if Israel can break their infrastructure in Gaza and create a peaceful border there, then, the goals are modest. I mean, they're never going to defeat the entire rotten infrastructure that's anti-Israel in the Middle East.
No.
But progress has been made. I mean, there's the Abraham Accords. There's a lot of things that have been positive. So,
and also, I'm sure you've seen it as well. that there are Gazans who are coming forward and complaining about Hamas and saying,
Yes.
that they're stealing the food, that they're hungry, they're not getting the food, Hamas is selling it, and so on, which didn't happen a few months ago. And again, I think that's important. And the fact that all those Arabs are very happy living in Israel. They don't have any desire to rush off to live in a Muslim country.
No, I mean it's better. I mean the Arab Israeli population is quite successful. I mean I interviewed Dr. Mordechai Kadar from he's a former Knesset member. He mentioned to me that Israeli Arabs tend to have gotten involved in the business of pharmacy for some reason, and that they're very successful in Israel. It's not
Yeah,
perfect, but they're pretty. Things are certainly comparable in a favorable way to other Arab countries. So Dr. Agnes Grunwald Spear is my
oh, can I
guest.
just show my book?
I was going to say, please hold it up.
There we are. It's a very
Who?
big book, as you can
Wow,
see.
that's a real doorstopper.
Yeah.
Who betrayed? There's a lot
But
of
you can read a chapter at a time. And
excellent.
yes, and also people say that my books are very easy to read in
Good.
spite of the subject, because I'm not I don't write as an academic.
Right. It's a popular style that is accessible. Now, where
Yes.
can people get your books, Agnes?
Well, they can get them from Amazon,
Mhm.
all over the world. They can get them from any bookshop where you can order it. They're all still in print.
Wonderful.
And I'd be delighted if people did. And I've got a website. You just Google my name and the website will come up. And that's got my email address on it as well. And I'd be delighted to hear from anyone who would like to continue the conversation.
Wonderful. Well, it's been a great pleasure and an honor to talk with you today, Agnes, and thank you very, very much.
Oh, well, yes, it's been my pleasure. And I'm glad it's been of interest. And
Indeed.
my sons would tell you I like a captive audience.
Well, great, and I'm glad that they've spurred you on to offer one. Anyway, thank you again, Agnes, and God bless you, and take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Bye bye.